Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on Idaho House Bill Known 345, a bill that could really change things when it comes to Medicaid in Idaho.
Oh yeah, this bill is going to be huge for folks in Idaho.
Big time. And we've got this memo from a legal analyst to the Idaho Legislative Council breaking it all down, and they're flagging some major concerns.
Yeah, they're really highlighting where this bill might clash with federal law
Yeah,
and, potentially impact your healthcare coverage.
exactly. So let's jump right in.
Sounds good.
I think the first big issue we need to unpack is federal preemption. The bill says any change to Medicaid in Idaho, like expanding coverage or costs, needs approval from the Idaho legislature. But isn't there a federal rule saying only one state agency should be calling the shots?
You're totally right.
Yeah.
The feds expect one executive agency to handle Medicaid, not the legislature.
So how does that work?
Well, the Supremacy Clause basically says if a state law conflicts with federal law wins. So if a future federal law requires Idaho to expand Medicaid, for example, this bill could cause a major roadblock.
So it's like the bill is setting up a potential showdown.
It could, yeah. It means the feds might not approve Idaho's plans, and then people might not get the coverage they need.
Wow, that's a big deal. But the bill does try to get around this by saying it only applies to optional Medicaid changes, not the mandatory ones. Does that make a difference?
It might help a little, but it doesn't totally fix the problem.
How so?
Well, for example, the Affordable Care Act lets states choose whether to expand Medicaid, which is what Idaho did a while back. But even though expansion is technically optional, once a state opts in, they're bound by all those federal rules. So if Idaho tries to limit even these optional changes, they could still run into issues.
Okay, so it's not a clean solution. There's still a lot of legal gray area there. Now, another thing that stood out to me is how the bill seems to bypass the usual rulemaking process. It's like they're saying, we, the legislature, make the rules, not the agency in charge of Medicaid. Is that even allowed?
So it's not technically illegal. The legislature has the power to make laws, and that includes laws that directly affect how Medicaid is run. They can skip the usual agency rulemaking if they want to.
So it's more about whether it's a good idea rather than if it's legal.
You got it. Bypassing the agency might raise some eyebrows, but it's not a legal violation in itself.
Interesting. Now, the bill also has this part that says changes to Medicaid should be tied to how much money the federal government kicks in. Is that something states usually do, and is it legal?
Oh yeah, that's pretty common. They're called trigger clauses, and they're often written into state laws about Medicaid expansion.
Yeah.
They basically say if the feds reduce their share of the funding, the state can change or even roll back its expansion.
So it's like, we'll play ball, but only if the feds keep their end of the bargain.
You got it.
And has the Idaho Supreme Court weighed in on this?
Yeah, they have. There have been cases where they've affirmed the legislature's power to control Medicaid funding, so this part of the bill is probably on solid legal ground.
Okay, so this bill is definitely trying to walk a tightrope between state and federal control over Medicaid. And as we've seen, there are some really tricky legal issues involved. But we're just getting started. Now, let's get into another big area of concern, the separation of powers. The bill wants to create this new Medicaid Legislative Review Panel. Doesn't that sound like the legislature is trying to step on the executive branch's toes?
Yeah, you're right. Separation of powers is a big deal in the Idaho Constitution. It means each branch, the legislature, the executive, and the judicial, all have their own roles. And traditionally, running Medicaid has been the job of the executive branch. This new review panel kind of blurs the lines.
Yeah, it's like the referee jumping onto the field and calling the plays. It seems like it could create a lot of tension.
Definitely could.
And the bill doesn't stop there. It seems to give the legislature a lot of power over Medicaid policy in general. Is that even legal?
Well, it's a tough one. The legislature does have the authority to set policy and put limits on what the executive branch can do, even for programs like Medicaid. And the courts in Idaho, they've generally been pretty deferential to the legislature's decisions, even when those decisions clashed with things like voter-approved initiatives.
So even though it might seem like the legislature is overstepping, they're probably within their rights to do this.
It's likely, yeah. But it could still cause conflicts and problems down the road, especially when working with the federal government.
That's a great point. What happens if the federal government, specifically CMS, feels like the legislature is meddling too much in how Idaho runs Medicaid? Couldn't they just refuse to approve Idaho's plans?
Exactly. CMS could say, hold on, we need a clear chain of command. We're not going to approve your waivers or plans if it looks like the legislature is calling all the shots.
So it's like a three-way tug-of-war. The Idaho legislature, the Idaho executive branch, and the federal government all fighting for control.
It has the potential to get messy, that's for sure. And it's something folks in Idaho who rely on Medicaid should be aware of, because it could directly affect their access to care.
So we've got this potential power struggle, and it all boils down to Medicaid. Now, let's talk about how this bill was passed. It was designated as an emergency law, meaning it took effect right away. Does that mean people don't have a chance to challenge it?
Well, the Idaho Constitution does allow for these emergency laws.
Yeah.
It's for situations where there's an urgent need to address something and it bypasses the usual waiting period that would allow citizens to, gather signatures for a referendum and potentially overturn the law.
So it's like a fast track for laws the legislature considers super important.
Right.
But doesn't that feel unfair? People don't even have a chance to weigh in before this law goes into effect.
I can see why people would feel that way. It definitely raises questions about transparency and public participation. However, the Idaho Supreme Court, they've consistently upheld this power of the legislature to use emergency clauses.
So even if people disagree with this law, there's not much they can do to stop it right now because of that emergency clause.
It'd be a really tough fight. Challenging the emergency declaration itself, it's been tried before, and the courts have usually sided with the legislature.
Okay, so that avenue is pretty much closed off. But what about the law itself? Rushing it through as an emergency law also meant it skipped the usual administrative steps. Could that lead to problems down the line?
Yeah, it could, like errors or even violations of people's due process rights. It's a valid concern, something to watch as this gets implemented. But skipping the administrative process isn't automatically illegal. The agencies in charge of Medicaid, they're still bound by due process requirements when putting this law into action.
So it might not be ideal, but it's not necessarily a legal violation.
Yeah, exactly. It's more a question of process and whether that process might lead to unintended consequences.
Okay, so we've covered federal preemption, separation of powers, and this emergency clause thing. But now, let's get to what I think is the most concerning part of this bill: the potential for discrimination. There are two provisions that really stand out: the ban on Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care and the work requirements they want to slap on able-bodied adults.
Those are the ones that raise the most serious legal and ethical questions, for sure. And they're the ones that could directly impact people's lives the most.
I mean, excluding transgender adults from getting medically necessary care under Medicaid just seems so wrong. It seems like straight up discrimination.
It definitely raises huge concerns under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
Right, because everyone should be treated equally under the law.
Exactly. And targeting transgender individuals for healthcare exclusions just seems to go against that basic principle.
And this isn't just hypothetical. Other states have tried to do this and gotten into some serious legal hot water, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are some really big examples from other states where courts have struck down similar bans on Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Like in Flack v. Wisconsin Department of Health Services, a federal court ruled that denying coverage for gender-affirming care violated the Equal Protection Clause. The court basically said you can't single out transgender people and deny them care that's considered medically necessary.
So the legal precedent seems pretty clear on this one. It sounds like Idaho is playing with fire with this part of the bill.
I say so. The courts have been pretty clear in saying that denying medically necessary care because someone is transgender, that's discrimination.
Okay, this part of the bill sounds like a legal landmine. Let's move on to work requirements. The bill says Idaho wants to require able-bodied adults on Medicaid expansion to work or go to job training to keep their coverage. I know this has been a big debate in other states. Have any of them actually pulled this off?
Well, a bunch of states have tried, but it's been a total mess. Legally and logistically, there have been tons of court challenges, and the outcomes haven't been good for states pushing work requirements.
So even though it seemed like this big trend, it's kind of flopped.
Yeah, pretty much. Courts have been striking down work requirement waivers left and right, and the Biden administration has said they won't approve any new ones. So for now, that idea is basically dead.
Okay, so work requirements are facing a tough battle, legally and politically. But there's a twist in Idaho's bill, right? They're saying Native Americans and Alaska Natives would be exempt from these work requirements. Why the special treatment, and does that create any new issues?
It's probably there because of separate federal laws and policies that protect tribal health rights. CMS, the agency that oversees Medicaid, has said that work requirements can't be applied to tribal members. So this exemption in Idaho's bill is probably to avoid a whole other legal fight with the feds.
So they're trying to dodge a bullet there. But it does feel a bit unfair, doesn't it? Like, if you're not Native American, you have to jump through these hoops. But if you are, you're exempt. It doesn't feel very equitable.
It definitely shows how complicated it is to balance state and federal laws and tribal sovereignty all at the same time. And it raises concerns about potential unequal treatment of different groups within Medicaid.
Right, like a well-intentioned exemption that could have some not so great side effects.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how messing with a complex system like Medicaid can create a whole bunch of new problems.
Okay, so just to recap, we've got this bill that wants to give Idaho more control over Medicaid, but it's bumping into all these potential conflicts with federal law. And then we've got these really concerning provisions about denying coverage for gender-affirming care and imposing work requirements, both of which have been challenged and struck down in other states. So much to unpack here.
A lot to think about for sure, but it's really important for folks in Idaho to get this. This bill could have a real impact on their health care and their lives. No doubt about it. And we're just getting started. In Part 2, we'll look at how Idaho courts might view this bill, given what they've said about Medicaid and state versus federal authority in the past. So stick around.
See you there.
Okay, so we've seen how this bill tries to shift the balance of power over Medicaid from the feds to the state, but there are all these legal questions, right? So now I'm wondering, have Idaho courts ever dealt with this kind of clash between state and federal authority before? Like, is there anything that could give us a clue about how they might rule on this bill?
That's a really good question. It's not like Idaho has a crystal ball for legal predictions or anything.
Right, of course.
But we can look at what they've said before. Like, remember the case of Reagan v. Denny from a few years ago?
Yeah, vaguely. Remind me.
That was all about the Medicaid expansion here in Idaho, the one voters approved. The
Yeah.
legislature at the time, they tried to block it.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
But the Idaho Supreme Court, they sided with the voters and said, nope, expansion stays. So that's a good sign, right? Like, they're protecting Medicaid from these kinds of changes.
Well, it's not that straightforward.
Oh.
What's interesting about that Reagan v. Denny case is that the court focused on the legislature's power over the money, the funding for Medicaid. They said the legislature gets to decide how state money is spent, even for programs like Medicaid that get a lot of cash from the feds.
So even though they upheld expansion back then, that same ruling could be used to back up what the legislature is trying to do now.
It's possible, yeah. It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
But the key is that state funding piece, right?
So are you saying if the legislature isn't trying to spend extra state money, they've got more freedom to mess with Medicaid, even if those changes go against what the feds want?
That's a good point. Reagan v. Denny does kind of hint that the legislature has more wiggle room to set conditions on Medicaid if they're not directly spending extra state dollars. But we got to remember that Reagan v. Denny, it didn't cover all the specific things we're seeing in this new bill. Like, this bill, it goes beyond just the money. It's trying to get the legislature involved in how decisions about Medicaid are made, which brings up all those separation of powers concerns we talked about before.
Okay, so it's not a perfect comparison, but it gives us an idea of how the Idaho Supreme Court thinks about the legislature's power when it comes to Medicaid. Are there any other Idaho cases that we should be thinking about?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There's another one that's super relevant, Luker v. Curtis.
Okay, what's that one about?
That case basically established that the Idaho legislature can change or even get rid of things that voters have approved, like those voter initiatives.
Wait, so even though the people of Idaho voted to expand Medicaid, the legislature could just come in and say, nope, we're reversing that.
That's what Luker v. Curtis says, yeah. As long as they're not violating the Constitution or federal law, the legislature has the final say.
That doesn't seem very democratic.
I get it. It's definitely controversial. But legally, that's how it is. So if someone wanted to fight this new bill in court, they couldn't just say it goes against what the voters wanted. They'd have to show the bill actually breaks a specific right or legal rule.
So saying, hey, the voters said this, won't really work.
It won't fly in court? No. But this brings up a really important point. If the legislature can just undo what the voters decided, what's to stop them from making even more drastic changes to Medicaid later on? Like, what's to stop them from just scrapping the expansion altogether? It's a real possibility. And it speaks to this whole debate about, the power of the legislature versus the power of the people. But there's still checks and balances in place. Voters can vote out legislators they think are going against what they want.
So it's like this back and forth, this push and pull between the legislature and the people.
Yeah. And what happens in any particular case, it all depends on the specific arguments being made and the whole political scene at the time.
So, Reagan v. Denny and Luker v. Curtis, those are two big ones. Are there any other cases from Idaho that might give us clues about how the courts might see this new bill?
Yeah, a few more. There's Reclaim Idaho v. Denny, for example.
What was that one about?
That case was all about the legislature using emergency clauses to pass laws, which is exactly how they passed this Medicaid bill. It was about the legislature making it harder to get those citizen initiatives on the ballot. They used an emergency clause for that, and the court said it was okay.
So this whole emergency clause thing, they've done it before and the courts didn't stop them.
Yeah, pretty much. It seems like the courts are giving the legislature a lot of leeway when it comes to these procedures.
Not encouraging.
But here's the thing. Reclaim Idaho v. Denny shows us that while the court might not interfere with how the legislature uses those emergency clauses, they're more likely to look closely to the actual law itself. So if a law passed with an emergency clause violates someone's rights or goes against federal law, the court will probably step in.
Okay, so maybe there's hope after all. The emergency clause might shield it at first, but the bill could still be challenged later. Now remember that Idaho State AFL-CIO v. Leroy case we talked about earlier, wasn't that also about the legislature's power and the courts being hesitant to overrule them?
Yes, that's right. That case is definitely relevant here. The court basically said they shouldn't be too quick to overturn laws made by elected officials, even if they disagree with the policies behind those laws. They upheld the law in that case.
So it sounds like anyone challenging this bill is going to have to bring their A game. It's not enough to just say, we don't like this law. They've got to show that it specifically violates the Constitution or goes against federal law.
Exactly. Vague arguments about overreach or going against what people want, that won't be enough. They need strong legal points backed up by solid precedents.
Okay. Last case, I promise. What about State ex rel, Evans v. Click?
Oh, yes. That case was about the legislature trying to veto rules made by state agencies without getting the governor involved. The court said no way to the legislature on that one.
So even though the legislature has a lot of power, there are limits.
Exactly. Evans v. Click tells us the Idaho Constitution lays out a specific way for making and implementing laws, and the legislature can't just ignore it. Checks and balances, making sure everyone stays in their lane.
But in this case, they did follow the rules, right? They passed this Medicaid bill as a law.
Right, that's important. Evans v. Click was about the legislature overstepping, trying to control what the executive branch was doing. This bill, they're setting policy by passing a law, which is different from trying to micromanage how the executive branch does its job day to day.
So Evans v. Click is more about setting boundaries than predicting the outcome for this bill, right?
Yeah, exactly. It says the legislature can't just do whatever they want, but they do have a lot of power to set policy, even for stuff like Medicaid.
All right, so we've looked at how Idaho courts have handled these kinds of things before. Now I want to zoom out a bit. I mean, Idaho isn't the only state trying to shake things up with Medicaid, right? Haven't other states tried similar stuff?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Idaho's not alone in trying to change its Medicaid program. Lots of states, especially those with conservative legislatures, they've been trying out all sorts of reforms, some working out better than others.
Let's start with work requirements. Have any other states actually managed to make those work? What's been the outcome?
Well, a bunch of states jumped on the work requirement thing a few years back. The idea was to encourage people to get jobs, become more independent, but it turned out to be way more complicated than they thought. And all those legal challenges, they haven't let up. Right now, not a single state has work requirements actually running in their Medicaid program.
So even though it seemed like this big new thing, it's kind of fallen apart.
Yeah, the courts keep shooting down those work requirement waivers, and the Biden administration's made it clear they won't approve any new ones. So for now, that idea is basically dead.
Okay, so work requirements are a no-go. What about attempts to just get rid of Medicaid expansion? Like Idaho expanded Medicaid a while back because of the Affordable Care Act. Have any states tried to undo that, and how did it go?
A few have tried, but they haven't really succeeded. Utah is a good example. Their legislature tried to roll back their expansion, the one voters had approved, but the federal government pushed back hard. CMS, the agency that runs Medicaid, they weren't happy. Utah ended up implementing full expansion anyway.
So the feds can really put their foot down if a state tries to walk back expansion.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
They can withhold money, deny those waivers if states don't play by the rules. They've got a lot of power when it comes to Medicaid.
Okay, so going against expansion is tricky. what about those legislative approval things we talked about before? The part of the bill that says the Idaho legislature needs to okay any changes to Medicaid. Have
Yeah.
other states given their legislatures that much control?
There are a couple of states that have done something similar, but it's not very common. Arkansas and Indiana are two that come to mind. They both built in strong oversight for their legislatures when they expanded Medicaid. Stuff like sunset clauses, meaning expansion would expire after a while unless the legislature renewed it.
So it's not unheard of, but Idaho is pushing the limits.
Yeah. And remember those provisions about excluding gender-affirming care? I'm guessing those haven't gone over well with the courts either, right?
That's my guess, too.
Yeah, you're right. States like Florida and Missouri have learned the hard way. They tried similar bans, and the courts shut them down. Denying essential health care because someone is transgender, that's discrimination, plain and simple. The courts haven't been buying it.
Do you have an example, like a specific case?
Yeah. Decker v. White. A court in Florida blocked a rule that banned Medicaid from covering gender-affirming treatments. The judge basically said the state had no good reason for the ban and that it was discrimination.
Seems like Idaho should take note of what happened in Florida.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. The message is pretty clear. These bans are on thin ice legally. States that try to push them are going to end up in court, spending a lot of time and money defending something that's probably going to get struck down.
Okay, so those big changes, they're risky. What about other parts of Idaho's bill? Things like switching to managed care and changing how much people have to pay out of pocket. Those are pretty common, right? Have other states had legal problems when trying to do those things?
Managed care is everywhere in Medicaid, and it's generally allowed under federal rules. It's all about controlling costs and making things run smoother by coordinating care through a network of doctors and hospitals. So that part of Idaho's bill is probably fine.
No legal drama there.
No, really?
What about the cost-sharing stuff? Like, I know Medicaid's supposed to be affordable, but can states just start charging people more?
There are definitely limits. Medicaid's supposed to be a safety net, and the feds have rules to keep it affordable. But states can apply for waivers to do things like charge premiums or co-payments for certain groups in Medicaid.
So there's some wiggle room, but not much.
Right. And those waivers, they're not easy to get. The federal government looks at them very carefully and only approves them if the state can prove the changes won't hurt people's access to care.
So I'm sensing a pattern here. It seems like when states try to make these huge changes to Medicaid, especially changes that restrict who's eligible or limit what's covered, they run into trouble. But if they stick to smaller tweaks, like adjusting cost sharing or switching to managed care, they're more likely to stay in the clear.
You're picking up on something important. It seems like the courts and the federal government, they're willing to let states play around with Medicaid a bit, but only if those experiments don't mess with the main goal of the program, which is to give health care to people who can't really afford it.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about what other states have tried and what the courts have said. Now, what about Idaho specifically? Based on all of this, what do you think is going to happen with this bill? Are we headed for a legal battle?
That's the big question. You can never really predict what courts will do, but looking at all this, I'd say some parts of the bill are definitely riskier than others. Those parts about excluding gender-affirming care and putting in work requirements, those are the ones that are sending up red flags.
So if I'm in Idaho and I need Medicaid and I'm worried about this bill, those are the things to pay attention to.
Definitely. Those are the parts that could directly impact people's access to care, and they're the most likely to be challenged in court.
Okay, so there's this potential legal battle brewing, and it all comes down to these two really controversial parts of the bill. But what if, just for argument's sake, Idaho decides to just go ahead with these changes anyway, even with all the legal risks? Is there anything that can be done to lessen the damage? Are there ways to make it less bad?
There are always options, legal and political ones.
Huh.
It all depends on whether Idaho is willing to listen to people and learn from other states that have tried this kind of thing.
Okay, so we've talked about potential fixes, legal challenges, the feds maybe stepping in, and the whole political side of things. A lot going on here.
It's a complex situation, for sure, with a lot of moving parts, but it shows there are options. There's always hope for things to change for the better.
Definitely. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to step back for a second and think about the big picture. We've seen how Idaho is trying to shake up its Medicaid program, but is this part of a bigger trend? Are other states watching Idaho thinking about doing the same kind of thing?
That's a good question. Idaho is definitely on the radar for other states, especially those with conservative legislatures who've been talking about similar reforms. But we have to remember that every state's different. What works in Idaho might not work somewhere else.
Right. So Idaho might be a test case, but not necessarily a model for everyone.
Exactly. And don't forget, the feds play a big role too. Their stance on all this matters a lot.
So it's like a chain reaction. If Idaho makes this happen, other states might follow.
It's a good way to think about it, but it's not a sure thing. There's so many factors involved, it's hard to say for sure what the impact will be nationwide.
Okay, so we're at a turning point, and the path Idaho takes could have implications for the whole country. Throughout this whole deep dive, we've talked a lot about the legal side of things, the politics, but I keep coming back to the people. This is about healthcare, a basic need, and what lawmakers do can really affect people's lives.
So true. It's easy to get lost in the legal details and the political back and forth, but this is about real people. People who need Medicaid, people who are already struggling, and they're the ones who often feel the effects of these changes the most.
It's not just some abstract debate. It's about being able to go to the doctor when you're sick, getting your meds, having access to the care you need to stay healthy.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to have these discussions, to raise awareness about how these decisions can impact people. We have to fight for solutions that put people's health first, for everyone.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. We've dug deep into Idaho House Bill No. 345, looking at all the potential problems, the big picture implications, and what it could mean for you.
It's been a wild ride exploring all the ins and outs of Medicaid. Hopefully you learned something new, something to think about.
We've seen that when states try to change Medicaid, they often run into legal and ethical roadblocks. And federal law and the courts, they're there to protect people from unfair policies. But the fight for good healthcare that's fair and accessible for everyone, that fight's not over. And your voice matters.
This bill shows us that the fight for healthcare justice is still happening, and we have to keep standing up for the right to good, affordable healthcare for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative and eye-opening. Remember, the more we know about these complicated issues, the better we can push for positive change.
So stay curious, stay involved, and stay informed. We'll see you next time.